that, please welcome Steve Trimble, Scott Berry. Thanks.
Because we basically look like the same person. I'm Steve Trimble, and this is Scott Berry.
That's right.
People, guys of an age.
Right, of an age,
with
yes.
leftover mustaches from the 70s, balding. But we've been involved with conservation basically all our lives. And so we thought we'd start by giving you just a very quick background about what that means to each of us and what conservation means. You know, Utah wildland conservation in 2025, conservation is a tricky word. And let's see, I'm gonna leave it up for just a minute here. So we both live part-time in Torrey, and the kicker, the impetus for this talk tonight was a request that I got a year or so ago from the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, from SUA, the demon of Southern Utah, to help them update Wilderness at the Edge. And it's this book, which I will pass around, which you may or may not have seen. Whoops, I can walk. That was published in 1990 by SUA to document the citizens' proposal for wilderness that they put together with dozens and dozens and dozens of volunteers to document wildlands in the state of Utah. And it's a remarkable book. We used to use it as a family to figure out where to go camping when our kids were little. And the foreword was written by Wallace Stegner, the great Western writer. And SUA is planning to update that book right now. And they asked me to write the foreword. So I am deeply honored. They couldn't get Wallace Stegner. He died in 1993. And so I have the just immense pleasure of writing a new introduction to this book. So it got me thinking about conservation in Utah and the history of conservation in Utah and where we are right now. And SUA has delayed publication because they can't tell what's going on. And Scott and I are going to try to help you a little bit figure out what's going on. So I grew up in Colorado, and my dad worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and we visited all the Utah parks when I was a kid, and I got the sense that the landscape mattered. My dad did a running commentary about what we were seeing out the car window wherever we drove. And I went off to college in the late 60s, and I had never really joined anything before, but somehow it was a time when there was a lot of, as you well know, there was a lot of action around. People were protesting the war, people were working towards civil rights, and it was the beginning of the environmental movement. And I joined the Sierra Club when I was a freshman in college, and I started getting the Sierra Club bulletin asking me to write letters about Utah wilderness, save the Kaparawits from mining, save the Escalante from a road proposed right through the middle of the Escalante wilderness. And I started writing letters to politicians and elected officials. And eventually I started writing op-eds and letters to the editor. And eventually I started writing books. And so I just have been doing that ever since, which is now more than 50 years. I moved to Utah in the 80s, and we've had a house down here in Torrey since 2000, which is now 25 years. And so that's a little bit about my background. This idea of conservation is a word that I find useful because it's pretty neutral. Environmentalism is weighted. All we're really saying is that we care about the earth in addition to humans. And it's a pretty simple concept. Scott?
Well, Steve and I's background is so similar, I feel it's very repetitive for me to add much to it, but my story is much the same. I've been a lifelong resident of Utah, grew up in Holiday in the Salt Lake Valley and exploring the Wasatch with my father, who also took me as a child to many of the national parks in Utah. He was a lawyer. He dragged me around to rural courtrooms in Utah. And when we went to court in Vernal or St. George or someplace, he'd take us, go to the nearest national park and So I was little. I bet I was just 8 or 9 when I saw most of those places. And all I remember that I was actually more interested in the little frogs in the river than the grand landscapes that surrounded me. But eventually I went to college at the University of Utah and got a law degree from the University of Utah, became a trial lawyer in Utah, practiced law for 50 plus years. And during that entire time, while I didn't get, handle many direct environmental cases, I was always tangentially involved in sort of the environmental campaigns in southern Utah. Along the way, I served on the board of a bunch of conservation organizations, starting with the Canyonlands Field Institute, Utah Wild Rivers, basically the Wild Utah Project, and until most recently I was the board president of Grand Staircase Escalante Partners. So through those involvements, I've had a deep involvement in southern Utah, and I've had a particularly deep involvement in Wayne County since I've had land and a hiding out place here since 1980. And now I have a small home in Fish Creek Cove, just south of town, that my wife and I built about 10 years ago. And I had the pleasure today of having my granddaughter and grandson out there with me, which is one of the reasons why you go to all the work to have those kinds of places. So that's kind of my background, and like I say, I think, I've thought about conservation the whole 50 years that I've been involved, and always tried to think reasonably hard about what it means. And I think, while my views continue to evolve about conservation, I still think it deserves a lot of attention, because I think there's unanswered questions in the conservation movement that weren't answered very well at the beginning, and I'm not sure they're really answered well today. So my ideas I hope tonight I'd like to tell you a little bit about my ideas about conservation. And they may even sound a little bit heretical, because they're not quite as pristine as what you might think, looking at my background with environmental organizations and my role here. So anyhow, that's who I am, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here with Steve, an old friend, to kind of talk about these subjects.
So we both served on the boards of the Wild Utah Project and Grand Staircase Partners, Grand Staircase Escalante Partners. And so when Scott says that he comes up with heretical ideas, that's why I asked him to join me tonight. So give us one of those heretical ideas about conservation. What do you mean by that?
Well, here's where my current heresy stands. Heresies always kind of evolve. But I've started to think that a lot of people seem to think of conservation as some version of locking up the family jewels in a safe, so they're protected. So they're in the safe, they're taken care of, you don't have to worry about them anymore. And it's kind of oriented towards the past, protecting something that we had, making sure we'll have it again in the future. And the idea that I've been thinking about is the idea that conservation would be more helpful if it was future oriented, where if it wasn't just about saving the stuff we had, but was more about preparing us for the future that we're all going to face. So it becomes it becomes an active noun, and it's less about protecting loss and more about using it as a platform, as a tool to prepare us for the future that's coming down the road. And I think if we see conservation in that way, it helps us think about new ways to imagine the world of conservation. And I kind of think, looking at the world in front of us right now, we can use new models of conservation, because currently, at the current moment, the old models don't seem to be working all that well.
What do you mean by conservation?
Well, conservation to my mind means engaging with the world around us in a way that it improves our lives, and we find better ways to share the world with all the humans in our human communities and all the life that we share this planet with. And so that's what's heretical about that is it's not necessarily about conservation, because I think that's a dynamic vision I just described, where things are changing in the natural world. Things are changing in the human communities we exist in. And we've got to take those dynamic models of the world we live in and incorporate them into thinking about conservation.
I went to a conference a couple months ago where John Leshy spoke. He was the lead lawyer in the Clinton administration and was very influential in setting aside Grand Staircase. And the bottom line in his talk was, no change happens without politics. And so looking to the future in the more idealistic way that you just described is inspiring, and yet we're stuck with politics. And we're stuck with politics right now that's completely impossibly challenging. And so the state of conservation right now is fraught and fragile, and yet we have to keep going. And we have to dream big dreams. And it's really complicated.
I totally agree, and I think what these ideas that I've been entertaining means that we've got to redraw the boundaries around conservation. So part of it is I think now that when we talk about conservation, it means conserving small rural communities, not in an unchanged way, but conserving small communities because they're important to the world that's coming towards us in the future. So it means if I were to talk now about conservation in a broad way, I would include communities. I would include the people that live in those communities. And what I would tell them is no one's going to be left behind. We're not going to leave behind rural communities. But also, nobody gets a pass on change. Change is going to happen. It's happening now. You can't say, this is what my grandfather did. We're going to do exactly the same things in the future. It means you're going to have to change. Your families are going to have to change. The economy is going to have to change. And as a community, we have to find ways to work together towards that future. And I kind of think that one of the things that we actually could unite around in a somewhat utopian version of the world is a collective vision of stewardship of these landscapes. That means not only protecting the land in the way that traditional environmental groups have, but finding ways to support and maintain and enrich the communities in which those lands are located. One thing I've noticed in my region, and I'm sure Steve has too, when you read about conservation work all around the planet now, the one thing you find in every successful conservation story is it depends on local support. It depends on bringing local folks into the circle of stewardship to protect these lands. The idea that you could just take local folks and ignore them or treat them as just a detail that could be ignored in the process is a recipe for failure. So it forces us to change our pace and change our gait and try and find ways to build, and first imagine and then build toward these new communities. And again, in a sort of utopian world, I think it could be done, but it's going to take time and energy and imagination and creativity and a lot of work.
And so the big question is, who are the locals? And the locals, the true locals, of course, are indigenous people. And there's a huge shift in the conservation world to pay more attention to native voices. And that really began with Bears Ears. At the time that Bears Ears was not even projected as a national monument yet, the conservation community, the traditional white environmentalist conservation community, was looking to expand canyon lands and bring the park up to the rims of the basin and make much more sense out of it as a geographic region. And as that movement progressed during the Obama administration, all of a sudden this proposal comes out of the Intertribal Coalition from 5 tribes saying, Bears Ears National Monument, we want co-stewardship. This is a native home, this is a place of healing. And by God, that's prevailed. And the white conservationists backed off and gave the tribes the lead. And Obama set aside Bears Ears just before he left office. And that idea of co-stewardship, which is very much based in the native attitude of the land as a healing place, has moved on to now have a similar coalition for Grand Staircase that happened just before Trump was inaugurated the second time. And the Biden administration setting aside 3 national monuments along the course of the Colorado River, all of which were ideas that came out of tribes. The Footprints of Our Ancestors National Monument, which also has a native name that I can't pronounce, on the edges of the Grand Canyon. And Awikame, the emergence place of the human peoples south of Las Vegas, and Chuckwalla, down by Joshua Tree. And all of those were driven by native people who are local. And the politicians and elected officials in these cases really did listen to those local voices. But in Utah,
Is
pardon?
that all in Arizona?
No, that was California, Nevada, and Arizona. And feel free to ask questions all the way along. This is a conversation. But in Utah, the idea of local, if you ask a member of the legislature, they will tell you how many generations they've been here since the handcart companies came. And it's a whole different place. It's a very different place than any other state. And it also happens to be the most anti-public land state of any other state. And I think that has a lot to do with the history of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who still feel like they were hounded across the country by the federal government and came here as a refuge and then were persecuted for polygamy and have been fighting the federal government for more than 100 years, 150 years, 175 years. And that attitude kind of combines perfectly with the sort of libertarian states' rights attitude that is common in many parts of the Intermountain West. And it makes Utah unique. But the Colorado College State of the Rockies poll done every year found last year that 82% of citizens in Utah think more emphasis should be placed on conserving wildlife migration routes than on new development, roads, ranching, and oil and gas production. They think that 84% support the creation of new national parks, national monuments, national wildlife refuges, and tribal protected areas. So there's this huge gap between the citizens and the elected officials. And it goes way back. And so I'm going to give us a little history, even though Scott wants to talk about the future. Let's start with the past. And I want to tell you a little bit about what the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance is thinking about in this new edition of Wilderness at the Edge, reimagining the Red Rock Wilderness Act. You may be familiar with this Red Rock Wilderness Act, which is the summary, really, of all that information and field work in Wilderness at the Edge, figuring out where are the remaining wild places in Utah and putting them on a map and trying to get some preservation or conservation or protection for those places. And over the years, all of those brown splotches have been identified as wild places. And the green is, let's see if I can make this work, places like these relatively isolated areas, those are actually designated wilderness, mostly on national forest land, like up in the Uintas and along the Wasatch. But the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance has prevailed 3 times in getting wilderness preserved and passed by Congress since the Wilderness Act was passed and since the beginning of SUA in the 80s. Out here in the West Desert in the Cedar Mountains, the Emery County bill that just passed a couple years ago, this complex here, and down in Washington County. And each time they had a partner in the elected official world. It was Rob Bishop, of all people, out here in the West Desert, who didn't want a nuclear waste dump and a railroad passing through that mountain range, leading to a nuclear waste dump on the Skull Valley Reservation. And in Washington County, it was Senator Bob Bennett. And in Emery County, where there had been actually quite a bit of tradition of trying to find a good compromise, It was a particular staffer in Senator Hatch's office, just at the end of Senator Hatch's term. And what SUA is now doing is thinking in terms of larger landscapes. So they have identified these two big landscapes, the Greater Canyonlands landscape, kind of working off that idea of Greater Canyonlands and Bears Ears, and the West Desert out here in the Great Basin. And all those brown splotches are the proposed wilderness in America's Red Rock Wilderness Bill, but they're now thinking in terms of these larger landscapes for all the reasons that conservation biologists can tell you, that you can't have these isolated places and expect all the animal communities to continue to survive in those islands of habitat. Things have got to be connected. So where are we? I always make a point of trying to remind us all that we are in the Colorado Plateau. This dotted line is the Colorado Plateau surrounding Four Corners. Torrey is right here at the edge of the high plateaus and the beginning of the inner canyonlands. It's a remarkable place to be. And what is the Colorado Plateau? Well, it's really defined by the Colorado River. If you look at the drainages, it's the Colorado River that carves these canyons and all of these rivers that flow into the Colorado. And so what is this idea of Greater Canyonlands? Well, if you look at all the protected areas within the Colorado Plateau, and you plop down Greater Canyonlands, you can see we're talking about everything from Arches over to Zion. Here's Arches, here's Zion, here's Capitol Reef, here's Torrey. So we are within Greater Canyonlands, and it's a pretty big chunk of that land, you know, if you plop it down onto that map. The West Desert, so interestingly, when I was working on the new intro for this new edition of the book, I realized that within that gigantic piece of land, Greater Canyonlands, there's only a sprinkling of towns, and the largest town is Moab at 5,000 people. You know, Wayne County has, 2,500 people, which is pretty much the same, almost exactly the same number that we had in 1940. You know, this is an unpopulated place. In the West Desert, there are no incorporated towns at all. And if you put the West Desert landscape, as SUA defines it, into the Great Basin, this huge area that goes clear up into Oregon, it's a much smaller piece of the Great Basin. But still, within Utah, that's a big chunk of land and really important. This goes way back. I could have just taken some of these maps right out of Fred's book on the national parks of Utah. But this is the famous map of the proposed Escalante National Monument in the Roosevelt years, with some of the more modern designations overlaid on it. And that heavy line is a national monument proposed in the 30s when Bob Marshall swept through the West and identified roadless areas in need of protection. And it almost passed, but the same forces fought it then that fight things now. People that wanted to graze their cattle in perpetuity on public land. People that wanted land continuing to be open for development, for extractive industry or real estate development. And so that boundary was withdrawn, and they came up with a second boundary. And this is the first time I've seen this map. I just found it in a source online just in the past few weeks. This was a second proposal after they got so much flack for that first proposal, and it basically follows the Colorado River from the state line up to Moab, which would have meant protecting Glen Canyon and Cataract Canyon and the Canyonlands. Here's the Green and the confluence of the Green and Colorado. That didn't happen. And if we go back to the original outline of the big national monument, we can look at this map that SUA prepared, and you can still see the same boundaries here. And look at what's happened inside of those boundaries now. Part of Capitol Reef, pretty much everything in the South District and up a little bit around Torrey and the headquarters area. Canyonlands, Bears Ears, Grand Staircase. And then SUA has also indicated the wilderness study areas and proposed wilderness. Really the only part of the Escalante National Monument that isn't either preserved or proposed for preservation is this lightly colored yellow land, which is BLM land that doesn't need another designation. Interestingly, this is the most detailed version of this I've seen. And if you follow the boundary over here by Torrey, you can see that it sneaks across from the park, from the headquarters area, over almost to Torrey, and then back to Fish Creek Cove. And so both Scott's house and my house would have been within Escalante National Monument, which is fun. So I mentioned these new national monuments. This is an incredible accomplishment that now is being referred to, at least at the moment, and perhaps only briefly, as the Moab to Mojave Conservation Corridor, starting with the new Chuckwalla National Monument by Joshua Tree and Canyon in California. And if you can follow the Colorado River all the way up to Moab, and there's just one preserved area after another. The Mojave Preserve, Awikame, the whole Grand Canyon complex here in southern Utah. It's really quite remarkable. And you can then keep going and connect to Yellowstone and the Yukon. We need connection. None of these maps incorporate tribal territories. And Torrey's right smack in the middle of all these overlapping tribal territories. That weird square is not indicative of where those people live, but it's a new recognition of the Timpanogos branch of Shoshones, which were always lumped in with the Utes. But when the Escalante expedition reached Utah Lake, they found people living there that they called that the Lake of Timpanogos, and they really were Shoshone, and they now have they're not a recognized tribe, but they're claiming more recognition than they've ever had, and there's no good boundary for them. So this is from nativeland.org, and they've just put a square there, which is a really misleading thing. But you can see here in Torrey, we've got Southern Paiute people and Ute people and Navajo people and Pueblo people and Goshute people and Shoshone people, pretty much all coming together in this area. A really interesting place for Native people. So what about these words? So I'm calling this intro, and I called our talk tonight, wilderness, wholeness, wildness. So what do those words mean? So wilderness, we use casually, right? But legally, in the Wilderness Act of 1964, wilderness has a very distinct definition. And when you're passing a bill in Congress to designate wilderness, it has to be an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. This is long before gender-neutral language, long before we paid attention to Native people. Undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character, affected primarily by the forces of nature, where the imprint of man's work is substantially unnoticeable. People have been living in these places for at least 13,000 years, and the impact of those people is never invisible, but there's still places that are wild. So what is wildness? The science writer Dave Quammen gives us a good definition. The name we give to living nature on planet Earth at its most robust, unfettered, undiminished, dynamic, and diverse. He lists 4 crucial ecosystem features that distinguish healthy wild landscapes: scale, connectivity, diversity, and processes. Processes that keep it going. And so that's one way to think of wildness. It gives us a way to define the word. And what about wholeness? So this is a paragraph of mine from the new intro. Without wilderness, without greater canyonlands in the West Desert, without these big coherent landscapes preserved in their wholeness and resilience, with a full complement of their still wild animals and plants, we lose a measure of our heritage. Those are the communities that Scott was talking about. We lose a fundamental part of what it means to live on Earth, to live with the Earth, to live as creatures embedded in our planet's evolutionary history. So what do you think?
Well, I guess I should start by saying, just like Steve, I've been involved in the campaigns over all these issues all my life, and I completely support all the programs and efforts and campaigns that Steve has talked about. But I have to say, at the end of the day, I don't think it's enough. Right now, we're seeing that the national monuments, national parks, public lands, in the forms they were created, are under attack and could well disappear to a large degree in the upcoming years. So behind many of these ideas is the ideas that, the federal government, hopefully working with, local partners, can draw a line on a map and say, we've put these lands inside this boundary. It's protected, it's preserved, it's in the safe with the family jewels. We can kind of forget about it now because it's taken care of. And that's where I kind of get my heresy comes out. I go, I have to think, no, all these definitions, to my mind, lack the human component. Now, Steve certainly covered the indigenous people's interest in this, but I don't think humans are just the indigenous people. I think we're all part of those human communities. And a word that's going to really take us into the future, or an approach, is to include human beings in all of the terms, these, what I would say, secondary terms that Steve described. If we're talking about wilderness or wildlands or any of the names we commonly used, they can't really be considered and understood without really taking into account the human communities that are involved in those landscapes. And so that means where the failure comes down to me, it's like, well, we haven't answered the question for many local communities, kind of like, why should we support this? I hate to say it because I hate the meism world we live in, but what's in it for me? What do I get out of this? And why should I do that? And I think that question for many Americans remains unanswered. I imagine if you're here at this meeting, you're kind of a nature and landscape lover just like myself. It's clear to you where your values lie and why you care about them, but we simply have not been successful in bringing the broader sections of America into supporting those lands the way we've talked about. I always get a kick out of the polls that Steve pointed out because I go, what's going on here? Because all the polls go in the direction that Steve just described. But in Utah in particular, and in the West in general, it seems to me virtually all the voters in those polls must have literally walked out of the living room and gone to a place to vote for people who are trying to take apart the institutions that first created and then try and manage those lands. So there's some sort of like giant mental disconnect there. And I think the disconnect may be related to the fact that it's this idea that conservation is a task that's accomplished at one point in time, and once it's done, we're safe. We don't really have to worry about it anymore. Instead, we'll worry about the issues of the day that our politicians like to kick around. That's what we want to pay attention to. So I'd kind of like to take those words that Steve highlighted and redraw them in a way and try and reimagine communities of the West, the communities of these public lands, where they have a direct financial interest in serving as stewards for this land. This land needs care, it needs management, and I think our country, if we spent our money in the right ways, could find the way to reward the stewards of the land, to compensate them for taking care of the land. One idea that's floated around is like paying counties, rewarding counties with funds for the amount of protected areas they have in their counties. But I think a lot of interesting ideas could come out of trying to involve local communities in new ways in these efforts. And the challenge becomes, so often it's been, well, when we talk about locals, what we're talking about is like they're frozen in time. Like the only thing we can do in Wayne County is run cows and grow alfalfa. And anything that challenges that version of the world we live in, well, that's not acceptable. And that's why one of my basic principles is why we're not going to leave anybody behind, but nobody gets a pass on change. Things are going to change. They're going to change in these communities. And frankly, I hope the institutions and structures and the laws that address these questions are going to change. And that means that some of the old standards that we relied on, the Wilderness Act is a beautiful piece of legislative writing. But I no longer subscribe to kind of the view of wilderness I held in 1975 because it's a static view. You know, these are lands untrammeled, they're pristine, where nothing's going to change. As we all know now, everything is changing in nature, and it's changing quickly. So if we start from a premise that we're going to prevent change and man doesn't have a role in these landscapes, that's crazy. It's obvious, you know, bizarre given the role that indigenous peoples played in these landscapes, but it's bizarre today because we look around, and even in Wayne County where we don't have much of an indigenous presence, men have had a lot to do with the way this landscape is shaped. And so I think that that kind of view has to be incorporated in the conservation of the future. And that sounds a little heretical to lots of folks, but there you go. I've always been a bit of a heretic.
But the catch is that right now, you know, we're up against a state legislature and a governor and a congressional delegation and a presidency that want to sell off the public lands, develop them, you know, give them over to the wealthy, let the wealthy have their way. And so we have to fend them off, right? And we have to use the laws that we've got.
Right. That's why I said I support all the campaigns you talked about, but I'm not kidding myself that it's enough. We could protect all those things next week, and in 2 years from now, I mean, they could be ignored. Even right now, I mean, basically the public lands management system we have now has been failing for 50 years because the resources, the financial resources, the staff resources have gradually eroded and attenuated to the point where we have agencies that are out there, but they don't have the staff, they don't have the money, they can't do the jobs they've been assigned, and they're locked in a view that says, well, our real goal is to, like, one, keep our heads down, and two, protect the traditional powers that be. That's what we're going to do. And I think so. We could put more lines on the map. We could create more monuments. I think those are all good things, and I hope we do them. But that's where I guess I'm a bit of a pessimist because I think, you know, I don't think it's going to work in the long run. I don't think unless we can really work the whole human element into the fabric of protecting these places that we're going to be able to successfully do so in the long run.
So I know you've been thinking about this for a long time. Whoops, I'm going to fall out of this. This is going to collapse on me, yeah. As a matter of fact, I have notes here from an interview that I did with you in 2011. I was working with the Nature Conservancy on a project to report back to the Nature Conservancy on how to spend a bunch of money they were going to get from the Packard Foundation on the Colorado Plateau. And the question was, what are your iconic and transformative dreams for the plateau?
What did I say? That's cute.
Well, here's what you said. And it's pretty much what you just said, but it's a little more specific. Actually, you said a couple things that we've actually tried. The first one was, let's see here, create and fund new Colorado Plateau political institutions that will, over a period of 10 years, replace existing county commissioners with commissioners committed to conservation as the basis for healthy economies. Well, that hasn't exactly played out, but the Rural Utah Project has made some progress.
Right? We've tried.
That's right. The other one that was on here that we kind of tried, where was it? Well, I'll get back to it. The two I was going to read to you are kind of putting into more specific language what you were just saying. Develop a contest available to Colorado Plateau counties. The winning county receives a suite of social services in return for adopting and implementing a specific conservation plan. Special services would include scholarships, support for local education, health and welfare programs, in particular for elderly populations, financing for new conservation business, transportation, water development, etc.
What foresight.
You compared it to the Carnegie Library program where, Bicknell and Blanding both changed their names in trade for a library back at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think only one of them got a library. Alternatively, offer significant cash prizes to counties that meet quantitative conservation goals defined in terms of maintenance of biodiversity and habitat protection. So I often think of my writing as aspirational, but yours is a bigger dream than that.
It is a bigger dream. It
It's-
is a big. I'm running out of runway though, so I got to dream big at this stage.
So, anyone out there have an answer to the question, how do we do this?
Yeah, I do want to say this. I wish I had the answers to this. I wish I could sit down and outline the program, how we're going to all reach this. But I think it requires, the interested public, the people that already love these lands, to exercise their imaginations and their own creativity and their own energy to work to create these new models. And so that's about as amorphous as it can be. But I really don't have any other way to approach this problem. Because the one thing I don't think is going to work is I don't think there's any authority in heaven or in Washington or in the county commissions even that can say, we're going to fix this for you, that we have the answer and we're going to tell you how to do it. I mean, it's going to take new ways of thinking about communities and landscapes. And I'm very encouraged by what Steve talked about with the indigenous populations, because they're doing just what I hope for. I think they're serving as models for these new models that could expand, where they have a very, a history and a strong local voice and a different vision of how to manage lands. I think people with those same qualities exist probably in this room and in this county and in this town. If they can be somehow engaged and brought into the process, that would be the trick. That would be the wonderful thing that we could accomplish. But frankly, the indigenous people, the Native Americans, have an advantage because they have these existing political institutions. They have the tribal institutions that have existed now for a long time, more or less active in more or less different places along the way, but they've had a political voice that they could talk through. And right now, like in Wayne County is the classic example. People, even though I've been here for 45 years, what am I? I'm not a real local. I'm sort of a semi-local, because I'm never going to be, even though I've been voting here for 20 years, it takes something more to get into the political community down here where you can feel like you have a voice in the community. I've tried, one of my own projects was trying to get all the retirees and second homeowners to register to vote in Wayne County. Wayne County is pretty open to doing that, and if we could get a bunch more voters down here, maybe we could have a bigger voice in the community.
So do you imagine this as a state?
Could you go to the mic so the people watching?
I can talk.
No, but people streaming,
So
the
the
people
video records your question.
Where do I have to go?
It's
over there.
right to the right of Amy.
yeah. Otherwise the people on
You
this,
don't have to be on camera.
but otherwise the people who are watching
Do you
streaming can't hear
envision
you.
the things that you're talking about as something that happens at the state level? I guess I'm, stepping back thinking our federal laws don't really mean a whole lot, and they're probably going to mean less and less in the next few years. So, some of the things you're talking about are community-based, and so I think state, and so I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, I
on
think
that.
the state definitely has to have a role, but I kind of almost think it's got to be more local than that. It's got to have a strong local point of origin. The Emery County plan that Steve hinted to was like one of the great success stories in Utah environmental history, because it did have this, it started at the county level, and the county was willing to listen to and go through a gigantic negotiation, mediation process with environmental groups. And finally the county came up with a position that they could live with, they could favor, and then they had to take it to the state. And the state was frankly reluctant, but at the end of the day, with the strong local support for that, the state, said, well, if that's what the locals want, we can live with what they're proposing. So that's kind of how I see the process. I'd just like to see the state get in the neutral corner.
Yeah, but it's not going to. So
Well, it's not going to, but how does that help us? If we know it's not going to, or
then we have to work locally.
that means that we've got to work locally. We've got to work where we are.
Yeah.
And we've got to work, and I come from sort of my natural way of thinking is fairly abstract. So I guess I'm at least as much interested in thinking about abstract models of ways to work towards these goals as what we're going to do next week. That's important because I work on next week too, but I really think we need to try, I think I'm trying, I think even many people are trying, is to try and expand the models that can be brought to bear on trying to move into a conservation future.
And you could turn on the lights, because I'm not going to show any more slides. So we could see each other.
Scott, could you speak a little bit more to what Emery County did right historically? I think Stephen as well, you spoke to like they had a long history of cooperation. What are they doing that counties like Kane and Garfield and Wayne are not doing or could be?
Well, and Steve probably can answer that better than me. My sense was that, like, you know, while there was a conservationist position about Emery County wilderness, it started off as a bigger area. And the county said, well, no, we're not going to go along with that big area they're describing, but we'll talk to you about other things we could do inside that area. So what they ended up doing was slicing off a pretty big chunk of it as a wilderness area, but they sliced off another big chunk of it and gave it another designation,
National Conservation Area.
conservation area, where the rules were less strict and allowed, you know, a broader range of activities that wouldn't be allowed in the wilderness areas. And so there was discussion and negotiation and compromise to get to that point. But I have to say, the weird thing about Emery County is they were willing to have the discussion. I mean, I think people have tried in many counties in Utah, including Wayne County, to have discussions like that, and we don't really get very far.
You know, but Emery County really was a unique story. When I was working on book projects in the 1980s, and talking to people who I should interview, there was a guy in Emery County named Scott Truman, who was either a county commissioner or worked for the county, who was already thinking about where's the compromise? You know, what can we do that will create a future for Emery County, that will draw tourists, that will preserve land, that will keep the environmentalists happy, that isn't too radical. And so they were thinking about it for decades. And when SUA, and it boils down to those individual people. When SUA found a particular staffer in the Hatch office who was willing to work with them, then they found their way to compromise. And once they did, a lot of the other politicians, including John Curtis, took credit where credit was not due. But by God, they passed the bill. And so compromise is possible, but it boils down to trust and individual people trusting each other.
I'm just wondering, going back to, or staying on the topic of Emery County, has this been in place long enough for people to see the positive outcome, the output of that then that can be articulated very clearly and succinctly to, you know, basically do a sales job for, we need to do this again?
I think many people know about it. I think it could be used in other places, but there's two factors. One, you've got to find that doorway, that a local that will allow you to have these conversations and work with other voices for a long period of time in difficult settings. And the other thing that's changed is America has changed. You know, it really has. You know, I think 25 years ago, and the Emery County thing started at least 25 years ago, you know, the idea that you could work with your opponents and come to a mutual agreement was more open. Now, you know, we're so divided that it comes down to like, well, the first thing we've got to know is which political tribe are you a member of, and we're not going to have anything to do with anyone on the other side of that line. And so that challenge has gotten more difficult in at least the last 15 years than it was before.
I don't think the Emery County bill has been in place long enough to see, you know, to really document a lot of change. Another thing that happened in Emery County is Joe's Valley. Do you guys know about Joe's Valley? Yeah. You know, it's a world-class bouldering site up in the hills above Castledale. And the folks in those little towns, Castledale and Orangeville and some of those little towns, they started seeing all these kind of dirtbag climbers coming from all over the world and wondering why they were there. And then they started opening up coffee shops in the front room of their home and stocking kombucha in the local 7-Eleven and making money from those dirtbag climbers. And they started actually making friends with each other. There's a lovely little movie about this. And there was one particular local guy that was sort of the spark for this. And then the climbers started coming to town and helping with cleanup projects. I mean, it really became a community. And I think that kind of stuff can lead toward big change. You know, when you're talking about change, you never used the word climate either.
Yeah, I did mention that. Well, that's part of the everything's going to change.
Yeah, look at the fires on Monroe Mountain, you know? So that kind of change is coming fast and furious.
I mean, that's what I said. The change is coming, and so, you know, everybody has this. This is one of my favorite Patrick O'Brien books. One of the heroes has a favorite saying is, "Let no new thing occur." And I kind of like that. I'm sort of like that. Let no new thing occur. But I kind of smile at myself because, no, new things need to occur. They're going to occur. And our only hope is to try and shape them in positive ways towards, you know, the future that we're moving towards. I mean, look, I kind of like Wayne County. We're an agricultural county. How many times has everybody in this room heard that? And I'm totally happy with that, except I think the traditional agricultural community in Wayne County, it's not going to survive another 50 years, probably not 25 years. With changes in climate and gigantic reductions in federal programs that support agriculture, and the aging out of the demographic group that you know did that work, and the amount of remuneration that's possible in that work, I just don't see a happy future for saying, oh, we're always going to be a county that puts 80% of our agricultural lands in grown alfalfa. I think that's a fantasy to think that's going to work forever.
It doesn't generate very much of the county's economy.
I know it doesn't. That's one of the interesting things, because I'm always tended to say, well, follow the money, but that isn't about money. There just isn't that much money in the economy today based on agriculture, but it does support a traditional rural lifestyle, which I'm quite fond of. But that's what I keep saying, well, you know, what's the good part about running cows in Wayne County? Well, the good part is you get out on horseback, you get out on the land in the morning, you watch the sun come up, you see the animals, you're doing an activity that you personally really enjoy. You get to work with your family on roundups and work days. You get to take the grandkids out there and enjoy the landscape. You can do all those things without running cows all over the landscape. So my pitch to that group is to say, I want to save the things that I think, my guess is that you like the most, the things you really love about ranching can be preserved. We just are going to have to change and not do it in the same way we've always done it in the past.
It's a matter of identity as much as anything. A few years ago, Dwight Williams did a presentation here at Entrada about cowboy culture in Wayne County. And he was a wonderful man, and he was incredibly charming, and he told great stories. And toward the end of the talk, my wife Joanne asked one of his kids, so what do you do about health care? And the answer, of course, was, my wife works as a teacher. My wife works for the park. My wife works for the federal government. You know, it's hard to get folks to admit to the fact that that's crucial.
That is right. I mean, what's the joke? America's an insurance company with an army. And I kind of think well, Wayne County is it's sort of the same way. It's like a government employment service that has a horsebacking hobby or something. I mean, that's really kind of where it is today. And I like that. I'm okay with that. I've got deep roots in Utah and in Wayne County. And I think it's a wonderful lifestyle to enjoy. But I think you got to embrace the idea that there's going to be change there, like the people in Emery County that got involved in that. And there's little pieces of that happen in Wayne County and Moab and Escalante and Boulder. I was one of the owners of the Boulder Mountain Lodge for 50 years, and we started the lodge with exactly that goal in mind, that we wanted to create an institution in Boulder that would basically support the various environmental campaigns in Utah and grow the community. And I look back at it now, 50 years later, and I look back and pat myself on the back because I think it worked. I really think it worked. There's all kinds of new people in Boulder that are there simply because the lodge was started and kept plugging away at that job for all those years.
Okay. We've got some questions coming in from Facebook land.
Good.
Bill Inglesby would like to talk a little bit more about compromise. And he says that David Bauer once said after he compromised on Glen Canyon Dam, he would never compromise again. And it appears that policy continues. So do you think the two sides can ever agree to compromise moving forward, given how divided things are?
You know, Sue agreed to that Emory County bill, and Sue has always been like, you know, we've drawn a line in the sand, we're never going to change it. And I was happy to see that Sue, when the opportunity presented itself, turned out to be a trustworthy and honorable negotiating partner.
They did the
for
same
that
thing
whole
in Washington
process.
County too.
And Washington County as well. So yes, Sue can compromise, but what it's kind of like at the international level. They can't really be preconditions. Sue won't come to the table if someone says, well, I'll negotiate with you, but if you'll agree to such and such before we start the conversation. Sue won't do that, and frankly, no good negotiator will do that. And so I don't take anything away from Sue from resisting, you know, and getting drawn into those types of situations.
And I would point out that the the extreme right that is in charge of our country at the moment is not much interested in compromise either.
No.
And so it isn't just the far left or the tough environmentalists who are not looking for compromise.
No, it's exactly. I was a board president of Grand Staircase. I got involved in the litigation over the monument, which is still continuing in various forms. But one of the things I try to do is the guy that's kind of in charge of public lands in Utah, Reg Johnson. He's the head of the Utah Public Land PILCO or whatever we call it. But anyhow, I called him up and told him who I was, and I think I've been around long enough, they sort of knew who I was. And I said, Reg, I'm on the board of this organization, and I think there's a lot of things we could agree on if we could sit down and just talk about it. I'm not asking for a deal, I'm just asking for a conversation. And that was the last I ever heard from those guys. They were not interested in a conversation.
More from the ether world?
Yes.
Another question back there?
Yeah, it's a long one.
Good.
This is from Barbara Rose in Teasdale. She mentions, she said her recent big worry has been the fight to preserve our public lands throughout the West. She says, I'm sure you've read the 2022 book, The America of Ours by Nate Schweber, who talks about Bernard and Avis
Devoto.
Yeah.
Some consider Bernard as a conservationist and the first champion of public lands. He was also a native Utahn, like you, Scott, and did so much to protect our parks, forests, and places like Dinosaur National Monument. She thinks these same kind of battles are happening again, but what seems to be different this time is a recent movement to involve more locals who use these public lands. She sees them as now beginning to work more with conservationists and seem to be making a difference, first in Montana and Idaho, but perhaps we can use more of these people in Utah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's weird, there's disasters often have a silver lining, and I have to say, like, the rural disaster that's resulting from the current Washington policies could create an opening for discussion and cooperation along mutual lines. I'm worried about, we're losing government jobs in Wayne County right now with the Forest Service, with the BLM. All kinds of various federal subsidies are going away. I'm worried about, the financing for the Bicknell Health Clinic. I don't understand the details of it, but I'm afraid that there's going to be a loss there. And I've wondered, well, if the counties start to appreciate that they've got real challenges in those fronts, and if the conservationist community can say, hey, we agree, we also share those goals. Can we work together to find common ground on all our issues and present a joint face to address these challenges? There might be some hope there, and I bet you hopefully that's what Barbara's kind of talking about.
But I do love her mentioning Bernard Devoto, who is one of my heroes. You all probably know his name, but he was Wallace Stegner's mentor, and he was writing the Easy Chair column in Harper's Magazine in the 50s, and calling out the powers that be about their attacks on public lands then. Like he also came up with the great phrase, this is what the people in the West think about the federal government, get out and give us more money. And so he basically saved Dinosaur National Monument from a dam, but David Brower, who was the head of the Sierra Club at the time and didn't know anything about Glen Canyon, made a compromise, gave away Glen Canyon in trade for stopping the dam in Dinosaur, and regretted that the rest of his life. The famous book about Glen Canyon, The Place No One Knew, was not really true. There were people that knew Glen Canyon, and maybe even some of you were there as a kid, but not enough people knew it. And that's a really good argument for continuing to publicize and write and make pleas and show up and write and do all those things. And Devota was great about speaking truth to power with a great deal of help from his wife, Avis. That's a great book that she mentioned by Nate Werber.
Well, the great part of that story is she was a great friend of Julia Child.
That's right.
So, like, I think what a strange connection that was.
We have no idea what time it is, but I have a couple paragraphs I'll read at the end.
Excellent.
So it's time to close?
It is time to wrap it up.
Okay, so I'm going to close with a couple paragraphs from Diana Haro, who was SUA's organizing director and Comunidad Latina organizer, who I have not even met. And she's new and young, and she wrote these paragraphs at the end of a piece in the current SUA newsletter. And she starts by talking about her gardening as a way to take herself away from the fight, at least for a few moments. Time and time again, the people in Utah and across the country stand up to protect and defend public lands, and we are stronger working alongside each other than apart. SUA board member Olivia Juarez noted that even in the darkest of political times under this final Trump administration, our movement to honor Utah's sacred wild places has become more confident and vocal than ever. Come what may, there will be constituent calls, emails, meetings with congressional staff, pointed op-eds, and spirited rallies. Our continued wins will be made possible not by luck, but by the deliberate, courageous, and strategic action of activists and organizations across the country. We know that those currently in power will continue to unravel decades of struggle and hard-earned progress toward a more equitable, just, and safe society for everyone. We know their push to control and commodify our bodies, lands, and communities with zero regard for our collective future will not stop. And we recognize that protecting public lands falls short of the immediacy other threats currently pose to vulnerable populations and frontline communities who bear the impact of unjust policies and provisions. But we also know this: the only way to defend our lands, waters, and air is to protect our collective future and each other. So we'll keep planting seeds, and like the snap peas climbing toward the sun, we'll keep reaching together. We'll keep organizing.
I'll give you my short version of that. It's much shorter. I'm gonna like retreat to popular entertainment, and it's one of the phrases that Harry Bosch uses all the time. Everybody counts, or nobody counts.
There you go. That's it.
That's it.
Thank y'all.
Steve